No one wakes up one day and simply decides to leave everything behind. But it was different for Abraham. That morning, the wind seemed drier than usual, and the smell of the desert wafted through the cracks in his tents like an omen. He already had an established life in Haran. He had flocks, servants, a faithful wife, and the comforts that years of work had provided. But there was something about that call that he could never explain in words. It wasn't an audible voice, nor a dramatic vision. It was a certainty that took hold of his chest, as if someone had lit a flame inside him. It was God, and he was asking something unthinkable. Leave your country, your relatives, and your father's house. Abraham was not a young adventurer. He was already old enough, had responsibilities, and had a fairly stable life. But when he sat with Sarai by the fire that night, his eyes could not hide the weight of what he needed to say. He told her about his calling, about the promise of a distant land, and countless descendants. Sarai did not shout, did not question, but simply looked at him with a silence that spoke louder than 1,000 words. Lot, his nephew, also agreed to follow. No one knew exactly where they were going or what the route would be like. They only knew that they could not stay any longer. And when the first rays of sunlight touched the sand, the tents were dismantled, and the journey that would change everything began. Days passed, and they finally reached the land of Canaan. There were no palaces, no crowds waiting for them, just dry fields, distant hills, and clear skies. But to Abraham, this was holy ground. He felt it the moment he stopped and looked up. That day he piled up stones and built the first altar. It was not an imposing monument, but it was enough to mark the place where God had made a promise. He prayed silently, with the desert dust clinging to his skin and his heart full of expectation. This was just the beginning, but deep inside him, he was already certain that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Abraham had no map, no guarantees. What he had was a word, and that was all. The path to Canaan had been difficult. They had passed through dry regions, hostile terrain, freezing nights and scorching days. Some of his servants began to murmur, others doubted whether this old patriarch really knew what he was doing. But he did not back down. Each step he took in the desert was like a silent declaration of faith. He walked not because he saw the way, but because he believed in the one who had called him, and that made all the difference. Even when everything around him seemed uncertain, there was a steadfastness in Abraham's eyes that gave courage to those who followed him. At that first altar in Canaan, Abraham did not ask for riches or security. He simply gave thanks. He gave thanks for having arrived, for being alive, for having Sarai by his side, and for still believing. The altar of simple stones represented more than a religious gesture. It was the mark of a covenant. There he surrendered his entire life, his future, his fears and hopes to God. And although he did not yet have any land in his hands, nor a child in his arms, there he began to believe that the impossible was only the beginning of what God could do. The silence of the desert around him made that moment seem small, but it was there that an eternal story began to be written. Sarai, even though she didn't understand everything, was by his side. Her calloused hands helped to steady the tents on the new soil. Lot was there too, still young and impressed by his uncle's faith. They didn't know what was coming, but the air in Canaan felt different. It was as if something sacred hovered over the place. There were no great signs or visible miracles, just a quiet but powerful faith that was beginning to shape everything around it. Abraham didn't become a hero overnight, but in that beginning, when he built the altar, he took the first step that separates those who only listen from those who truly obey. The famine came without warning, and it was not a passing thing. The crops in Canaan were failing, the wells were drying up faster than they could be dug, and the animals were beginning to waste away. Abraham looked at his servants, his flocks, Sarai, and felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. It was as if the sky had closed. God had promised a land, but he had said nothing about the despair that would soon follow. So he made up his mind. They would go down to Egypt. There was food, opportunity, and perhaps some relief. It was not an easy decision, but it seemed the only way out at the time. As soon as he entered Egypt, Abraham faced a new fear. Sarai was a very beautiful woman, even at an advanced age, and he feared that the Egyptians would kill him to take her. So with a low voice and a heavy heart, he asked Sarai to say that she was his sister. It seemed small, a detail, a precaution, but deep down, it was a diversion, a hidden fear disguised as prudence. As soon as they arrived, the officials saw Sarai, praised her beauty, and took her to the palace. The Pharaoh, delighted, received her as his wife, and Abraham, silent, received cattle, silver, and servants, wealth tainted by a lie. But God did not remain silent. Plagues began to fall upon Pharaoh's house. Something was wrong, and the entire palace felt it. It was no coincidence. It was divine intervention. Pharaoh, confused and indignant, discovered the truth. He called Abraham and confronted him. It was humiliating. Abraham, the man who had built an altar to the Lord, was now being cast out as a liar. Yet God preserved Sarai, preserved the covenant, and allowed them to leave in peace. Carrying goods, yes, but also a mark on their hearts. Faith does not always keep us from falling, but it gives us the chance to get up even when we make bad mistakes. When they left Egypt, the silence between Abraham and Sarai spoke volumes. They knew they had failed. The desert was not just geographical, it was internal. It was the desert of doubt, fear, and insecurity. But there was also a discreet consolation. Even when they made wrong decisions, God did not abandon them. He intervened, protected, and corrected them, and that was stronger than any rebuke. The return to Canaan was not triumphant, but it was conscious. Abraham understood that depending on God was not just about trusting in promises. It was about trusting, even when everything seemed to go wrong. As time went by, Abraham and Lot's flocks grew much larger. What had once been a sign of blessing began to become a source of tension. The shepherds of both began to fight over space, water, and pasture. Small frictions turned into frequent arguments. Abraham watched everything with sadness. He did not want the land, which he had barely begun to inhabit, to become the scene of fights. More than that, he knew that conflict between brothers was the kind of crack that silently corrodes any promise. So he called Lot for a direct and peaceful conversation. No fighting, no pressure. It was time to part ways. Abraham was generous. Instead of demanding priority because he was older or because he had received the promise, he gave in. He let Lot choose first. It was a simple gesture, but one that was full of humility. Lot, looking around at the land, saw the Jordan Valley, fertile, beautiful, full of opportunities. To human eyes, it was the perfect place. Without hesitation, he chose to go in that direction near the city of Sodom. He didn't consult God, he didn't think twice. He only saw what was good in his own eyes, and he left. Abraham stayed in Canaan, amid dry hills and lands that seemed less promising, but he was at peace. After Lot left, God spoke to Abraham again, and what he said was like a balm. Lift up your eyes. Whatever you see, I will give you. That painful separation didn't diminish God's plan. In fact, it was a milestone. It was as if God was saying, "You chose to trust me. Now look at what I have for you." Abraham walked through the land, looked at the horizons, and his heart filled with hope. He may not have chosen the greenest lands, but he chose faith, and that kept him going. That same day, Abraham built another altar. Once again, he gathered stones and offered his trust to God. It was the third time he had done this since leaving Haran. Each altar was like a stake driven into the ground of faith. It wasn't about land or riches. It was about faithfulness. While Lot was moving towards Sodom and everything that seemed advantageous, Abraham was moving toward God. And that made all the difference. It was the heat of the day, with the sun overhead, when Abraham saw 3 men approaching. He had been resting at the entrance to the tent, but he immediately got up. He ran to meet them, bowed respectfully, and insisted that they stay. He prepared water to wash their feet and asked for bread, meat, milk, and butter, as if he were entertaining kings. He did not know who they were, but something about this visit was different. There was a presence that could not be explained, only felt. As the men ate, Abraham watched in silence. Sarai, as usual, listened from inside the tent. It was then that one of them asked about Sarai, and then he said something that made time stand still. "In a year, she will have a son." That was like an arrow to the heart. Sarai, inside, heard it and laughed. But it was not a laugh of joy. It was a bitter, disbelieving laugh. She was almost 90 years old. Her body no longer kept up with her dreams, and her hope seemed buried long ago. She did not laugh out loud, but laughed inside, as if trying to protect herself from yet another disappointment. But the visitor heard, and he answered firmly, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" At that moment, Abraham understood this was no ordinary visit. God was there once again, renewing the promise. Only now he spoke, specifically, with a set date. This took the promise out of the realm of the abstract. It was real, so real that it stirred the wounds of the past and defied all human logic. Sarai was embarrassed and tried to deny that she had laughed, but the truth was already exposed, and it was not for condemnation, it was for transformation. God was revealing that even the laughter of unbelief does not nullify his plans. He does not need our perfect faith, only our surrender. After the men left, the silence grew heavy. Abraham didn't say much, Sarai didn't either. But inside, something had changed. It was as if that word had ignited a smoldering ember deep within their souls. Now it wasn't just a distant promise. It was a reminder. God was still there, guiding every step, even when things seemed delayed. And if he said something was going to happen, then it will, no matter the time, the age, or the setbacks of the past. That afternoon, after eating with the 3 visitors, 2 of them went on to Sodom, but 1 remained. And there, standing before Abraham, God himself revealed something disturbing. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah had reached him, and judgment was inevitable. The words were harsh, heavy, and carried a weight unlike anything Abraham had ever heard before. They weren't just about destruction, they were about justice. But they were also personal. Lot lived there. Abraham knew that if God was about to act, he could not remain silent. With respect and boldness, Abraham began to intercede. It was as if each word came out of his mouth with fear, but also with courage. "What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you still destroy the place?" God's answer was clear. "I will not destroy it if there are 50. Abraham took a deep breath and went on, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. With each new number, Abraham came closer to God's compassion. He was not trying to manipulate God. He was trying to understand the extent of his mercy. And the answer was always the same. God would listen for the sake of the righteous. The conversation was not long, but it was intense. It was like a father speaking to the Creator, pleading not only for his nephew, but for anyone still trying to live righteously in the midst of chaos. Abraham did not ask because he thought Sodom deserved it. He asked because he believed in the goodness of God. And God, in his patience, heard every word, responded calmly, and did not reject the cry. When it was over, Abraham stood alone, looking out over the horizon. The city was still standing, but the sky already held a different atmosphere. Something was about to happen. What Abraham did that day was no small thing. He dared to speak to God as a friend, as someone who cared about others. He didn't save the city, but he revealed a heart willing to fight for it. And that was big. It was then that Abraham stopped being just a man of faith and became an intercessor as well. Someone who didn't ignore God's justice, but also cried out for his mercy, a balance that few can live with, and that episode will forever be remembered as the moment when a man argued with heaven and was heard. While Abraham was returning to his routine, the two angels arrived in Sodom. The atmosphere was heavy, filled with silent and depraved pride. Lot, upon seeing them at the entrance to the city, ran to them. He insisted that they stay in his house, offering them food and shelter. He knew that it was not a safe place, especially at night. And he was right. As soon as night fell, the men of the city surrounded the house. They wanted to abuse the visitors. It was a tense moment of pure despair. Lot tried to protect them. He took risks. He begged. But the wickedness had already surpassed all limits. Then the angels intervened. They blinded the men of the city and revealed to Lot the real reason for his visit. Sodom was going to be destroyed. He had to flee. Now, with his wife and daughters, without looking back, without hesitation. But not everyone believed him. His sons-in-law scoffed, thinking it was all madness, and Lot was paralyzed, confused. It took the angels to grab him by the hands and pull him out of the house. God's mercy once again extended even when the man wavered. They ran toward a small city called Zor, and behind them the sky began to change. Fire fell from the sky, sulfur, destruction, smoke that rose like from a furnace. There was no public warning. There was no chance for collective repentance. Judgment came quickly, accurately, without romanticism, and in the middle of the escape, one detail changed everything. Lot's wife looked back. A simple gesture, but it revealed a heart still attached to the city, and in that instant, she became a pillar of salt. Lot didn't look, neither did his daughters, but the absence of his wife by his side was a silent and painful blow. Escaping judgment doesn't always mean getting away with it. Abraham watched from afar. From the top of the hill, he saw the smoke rising. He may have wondered if Lot had escaped. He may have wept. But one thing was certain. He had done all he could. The city had been judged, but God had spared those who still feared him. The day ended in silence with the smell of ash and overcast skies. But in Abraham's heart, he knew that the God he served was just and merciful. And that was what kept him going, even in the face of loss and God's silence. After the destruction of Sodom, Abraham moved to a new region, Gerar. It was a strange territory with people he didn't know. And it was there that for the second time he made the same mistake. He said that Sarai was his sister. It was an old fear that resurfaced whenever he felt threatened. And the local king, Abimelech, took Sarai into his harem, believing that she was free. History seemed to repeat itself, as if Abraham had forgotten everything God had done. And for a moment, it seemed that he was putting the fulfillment of the promise at risk. But God intervened. That night, Abimelech had a disturbing dream. God appeared to him and said, "You are about to die because you have taken another man's wife." The king was frightened. He tried to justify himself. He said he had acted with integrity, that he did not know the truth. And God, in his mercy, confirmed this, but made it clear that it was he who prevented sin. It was one of those moments when you realize that God protects, even when human decisions are wrong. The Lord did not allow anything to happen to Sarai, and once again he preserved the promise he made to Abraham. The next morning, Abimelech called Abraham. He was outraged. He wanted to understand why he had lied. Abraham tried to explain. He spoke of fear, of custom, but it was difficult to justify. Even so, the king returned Sarai with honor, gave her gifts, cattle, and land, and he even asked Abraham to intercede for him and his house. God had closed the wombs of all the women in the region because of that mistake. But after Abraham's prayer, everything went back to normal. It was an unexpected outcome, the liar praying for the innocent. But once again, God's grace overcame human failure. This episode left its mark. It showed that even men of faith have setbacks. Abraham already had a history with God, but that didn't stop him from repeating an old fear. Even so, the Lord didn't take back his promise. He doesn't depend on the perfection of those he chooses. He continues to act, to correct, to protect. And perhaps it was there that Abraham understood, in a deeper way, that it wasn't his faith that sustained the promise, it was God's character. And this taught him to trust more, not in himself, but in the one who never makes mistakes. In that peaceful dawn, something different was in the air. Sarai, now advanced in age, began to feel something she never imagined she would feel. The pains, the movements inside her, everything indicated that it was no longer a distant promise. It was real. And so, almost unbelievably, the promised son arrived. Isaac was born. A healthy baby, crying loudly, surrounded by tears and smiles. Sarai, previously marked by the shame of sterility, was now a mother. She herself said, moved, "God gave me laughter." And that is why the boy's name was Isaac, which means laughter. Abraham stood there 100 years old, holding his son for the first time. It was the fulfillment of a promise made decades earlier. Every little detail of Isaac's arrival seemed to seal a new phase in their lives. It wasn't just the birth of a son, it was the beginning of the fulfillment of everything God had promised. Abraham made sure to follow every divine instruction. On the 8th day, he circumcised the boy as a sign of the covenant. Then he prepared a great feast to celebrate. It was as if everything finally made sense. The waiting, the tears, the mistakes, it had all culminated in that moment. The arrival of Isaac also brought healing. Sarai, who had long felt diminished, now walked with her face held high. It was impossible to hide the sparkle in her eyes. Women who had once looked at her with pity now admired her. And Sarai said with joy, "Who would have thought that I would give Abraham a son in his old age?" The promise was not only fulfilled, it transformed the identity of those who had waited. Sarai was no longer the same. Neither was Abraham. Their faith, once tested in silence, was now celebrated loudly, in front of everyone. This birth was not just biological, it was spiritual. Isaac was living proof that God never fails, that his timing is not ours, but is always perfect, and that waiting when sustained by faith will always be rewarded. The laughter that emerged in that house was not superficial. It was a laughter with scars, with memories, with history, and perhaps that is why it echoes to this day as a symbol that nothing is impossible for God, even when everything seems to have passed its deadline. As time went by, the atmosphere in Abraham's house began to change. Ishmael, Hagar's son, lived in the shadow of little Isaac, the son of promise. The tension between them grew, although it was not open. Ishmael, young and impetuous, often mocked Isaac without anyone knowing exactly why. Sarai, in turn, began to feel that this situation was threatening the peace of the family and the future that God had planned. It was a delicate moment where faith mixed with human pain. Sarai's decision was firm. She demanded that Abraham expel Hagar and Ishmael from their home. It was not an easy decision, but it seemed like the only way to preserve what they considered God's plan. Abraham suffered, knowing that it would be a time of great suffering for everyone, but he listened to what Sarai said. Even with a heavy heart, he consented. Hagar and Ishmael left, but not before God blessed them. God spoke directly to Hagar, promising that her son would become a great nation, even outside of Abraham's house. The key separation was not just physical, it was a deep cut in the family's soul. Isaac would grow up knowing that his half-brother was far away, somewhere, protected by a promise from God different from his own. And Hagar, even though she was expelled, experienced divine care in the desert. God did not abandon that boy or that mother. On the contrary, he showed that his blessings are not limited to human circumstances and that even pain can carry a promise. It was an episode that showed the hardest side of faith, making choices that hurt in order to preserve what is sacred. For Abraham, that separation was a test of faith and obedience. He saw the human consequences, but also the hand of God at work behind difficult decisions. It was a stark reminder that the journey of faith is never easy or comfortable, but is always guided by a higher purpose. And though hearts were broken, Abraham's spiritual legacy remained strong, a legacy that would extend far beyond the struggles, the losses, and the fears. It was on a day that seemed like any other that Abraham received a calling he would never forget. God asked him to do something that no father would want to hear: the sacrifice of his son Isaac. The news came as a shock, an impossible decision. Abraham, a man of faith, felt the weight of the request, but also the need for obedience. He did not argue, he did not hesitate openly. He prepared himself to follow the path that God indicated, even though deep down he felt a lump in his throat that seemed to be unbreakable. The walk to Mount Moriah was silent and tense. Abraham took Isaac, the wood for the altar, and the knife, all ready for the most difficult moment of his life. The boy, not understanding what was to come, followed his father with confidence. It was a scene full of unspoken emotions, with a mixture of fear, faith, and a pain that only a father can understand. Each step seemed heavier, each moment more tense. Abraham felt the presence of God, but also a silence that tightened his heart. When everything was ready, Abraham raised his knife to carry out God's command. It was then that a voice from heaven stopped him, loud and clear. God sent an angel who ordered him to stop. In Isaac's place, a lamb was provided for the sacrifice. That moment sealed not only Abraham's faith, but the eternal covenant between God and his people. It was a test of extreme obedience, but also a confirmation that God provides, even when everything seems impossible and painful. Abraham came down from the mountain different. He carried in his heart the certainty that his trust in God would never be in vain. The promise was reaffirmed, and the blessings multiplied. The story of the sacrifice that was not completed became a symbol for all generations. Faith that is tested, obedience that transforms, and the God who never abandons. That day, Abraham not only almost lost his son, he gained a faith that echoes to this day. After so many years of walking in faith, Abraham experienced one of the most painful moments of his life, the death of Sarah, his wife and traveling companion. She was 127 years old when she passed away, leaving an immense void in his heart. The loss was profound, but Abraham knew he needed to honor her memory in the best way possible. So he made a decision that would mark the beginning of something new. He bought the cave of Machpelah to bury her, the first piece of land officially acquired in the Promised Land. This purchase was not just a transaction. It was the recognition of a concrete step in the possession of the land that God had promised. Until then, Abraham and his family had lived as nomads, without a definitive property. The cave was small, but it represented much more than a place to bury Sarah. It symbolized the beginning of a legacy, the realization of a hope. Abraham made a point of making the purchase with a local man, demonstrating respect and legitimacy even in the face of the great divine promise. The burial was silent, but full of meaning. Abraham showed that faith also involves practical gestures, human decisions that align the spiritual with the earthly. He not only trusted in God's promise, but began to live the steps to ensure that it would be fulfilled. From that moment on, the patriarch gave a clear sign. The promised land was not just a promise in heaven, it was a real future for him and his descendants. This moment was a mixture of sadness and hope. The pain of loss was immense, but Abraham carried in his heart a greater certainty. God's promise would not die with Sarah nor with him. There was a future that needed to be built and protected. The patriarch's story that day was a reminder that true faith manifests itself both in waiting and in action, even when the path is marked by difficult goodbyes. Abraham knew that for the promise to be fully fulfilled, he needed to find a wife for his son Isaac, someone who shared his faith and divine purpose. So he sent his faithful servant Eliezer on a crucial mission to find a wife in the land of his ancestors, far from Canaan. This journey represented much more than a simple search. It was the continuation of God's promise, a fundamental step for the future of that family that carried a sacred legacy. On the way, Eliezer prayed fervently, asking God for a clear sign to recognize the right woman. Arriving at the well, Rebekah appeared, a young woman with a generous heart and obedient spirit, who offered water to him and his camels with a naturalness that seemed written by destiny itself. It was the right moment, the meeting that would change everything. Rebekah accepted the proposal, and her willingness to leave her land and family to follow the calling was an act of faith that sealed Isaac's future. The marriage between Isaac and Rebekah was more than a union between two people. It was the confirmation that God's promise was still alive, renewed by a love that transcended generations. Abraham saw in this covenant the continuity of the divine covenant, a link that united past, present, and future. Rebekah, with her steadfast heart, became an essential part of the story that God was writing with Abraham and his descendants. This moment brought hope and certainty to Abraham. Despite the difficulties and losses, the promise did not fade. On the contrary, it grew stronger with each step of obedience and trust. Rebekah's story is a reminder that faith never walks alone. It manifests itself in the choices we make, in the people God puts in our path, and in the love that keeps the flame of the promise alive. Abraham lived a long life, marked by trials, promises, and unwavering faith. At the age of 175, the time came for him to leave this world. But even at the end of his life, Abraham's story continued to speak of reconciliation and hope. Isaac and Ishmael, sons who had lived through so much conflict and distance, came together to bury their father. This act of unity was much more than a simple burial. It was a powerful symbol of the spiritual legacy that Abraham left for future generations. The reunion of the brothers at Abraham's final moments showed that despite their differences and the pain of the past, there was a greater legacy that connected them, faith in God and the promises made to their father. It was a moment of recognition where the bonds of blood and spirit overcame previous conflicts. This gesture brought a feeling of peace, a hope that divine purposes would continue to be fulfilled through reconciliation and mutual respect. Abraham, throughout his life, was an example of obedience and courage. His journey shaped the history of faith and influenced generations that came after him. That day, when he was buried by his children, his story did not end. It gained a new chapter marked by the continuity of God's promise through future generations. The legacy that Abraham left was not only material, but spiritual and eternal. This final farewell reminds us that true faith transcends human hardships. What seemed like an end was actually the beginning of a new era for his people. Abraham's legacy resonates to this day, inspiring those who seek to live a life of trust and obedience to God. He is the father of faith, and his story lives on in every heart that chooses to follow the path he began. Abraham's story is not just an ancient tale, it is a living testament to faith, obedience, and courage that spans the centuries. He was an ordinary man who, faced with impossible demands, chose to trust God in a radical way. His journey shows us that true faith is not just about believing in promises, but about taking action, even when everything seems uncertain and scary. Abraham faced doubts, losses, and challenges, but he never lost hope in the God he had called to be his own. Today, his life inspires millions to follow a path of trust, even when the future seems bleak. God's eternal promise to Abraham extends to all who choose to obey and believe. Promise of transformation, of blessings beyond what the eye can see. This story reminds us that God is always present, guiding, providing, and renewing our hope, even in the most difficult situations. And so, here's a question for you to ponder. What if God asked you to do something today, something that seems impossible, that challenges everything you know? Would you have the courage and faith of Abraham to obey? May this question echo in your heart, motivating you to trust more, to walk with God, and to embrace the promise He has for your life. If this story touched your heart, share your experience or opinion in the comments. Let's work together to strengthen our faith and inspire others to find hope in the midst of trials. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any content that can transform your life and strengthen your faith. Each video here is designed to inspire and renew your hope. Also, take the opportunity to watch the other videos on the channel where we bring powerful stories and teachings that will help you walk with God every day. Thank you very much for being here. Until the next video, and may God bless you always.